basta. Enough is enough. Ya basta. Enough is enough. You ask why are we angry? I say look at history. The cause of all our troubles, it is not a mystery. There are those whose lives are easy, there are those whose lives are rough. Now is the time for us to rise and cry out, enough is enough! Enough borders, enough nations, enough corporate exploitation, enough racist air pollution, enough racist institutions, enough chains, enough cages, enough starvation wages, enough highways, gas stations, thieving corporations, we won't take it anymore. Yeah, this is class war. We'll fight you in the streets and we will dance at your defeat. Ya basta. Ya basta. Oh, there will be a...
Hello. Wow, it's pretty amazing to see people using this space in this way. This is a great use of space. Thanks to everyone for coming downtown. We often do these things in rooms with fluorescent lighting on campus. And this feels like a pretty nice change of scenery, so I'm glad you're all here. My name's Brian. This event today is put on by a group in town called Solidarity Halifax. So we'll just give a brief intro to them and then introduce our speaker, and we can go on from there. Solidarity Halifax is an anti-capitalist organization based out of Halifax here. Its members are diverse. There's people from the student movement, the labor movement, the women's movement, from anti-racist work, just to name a few. We're involved in a pretty wide range of issues, one of those being right now student politics and organizing. So there's a few members of SolHal who are students or involved on campus, and we have a few projects on the go, one of which is talking about and developing an analysis about the education system, looking at it as something that exists in capitalism, and how the education system might be something different than what it was originally intended to be these days. I'm not going to talk too much more about that. That's what Max is going to do. I'm excited to introduce Max Haven. He's has a few things to his name. He's a postdoctoral fellow at York University. New York University. These are different things. New York University. He's involved with the Radical Imagination Project. He teaches cultural and critical studies at NASCAD University. I'm really excited to introduce him today. So give him a warm welcome, please.
Well, thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to have such a large group to talk with. I'm going to talk for maybe 20 minutes-ish about a couple of ideas, ways of framing the struggles that I think we're all involved in around the future of education, in particular post-secondary education and the university system. I would just say if we can clear a bit of a path here, because otherwise I don't think anyone's actually going to come and want to move through it, but they'll come and they'll hassle us about fire regulations. Because of course, in semi-privatized spaces like this one, or like in universities as well, there's always a premium put on policing the space. As the space becomes more and more commercialized, you need to make sure that things that aren't supposed to happen don't happen. Things that you can't charge admission for don't happen. Things that might offend someone don't happen. And of course, the number one client of this space is its original builders, the Alexander Keith's Brewing Company, which is actually owned by a Belgian corporation now. And I don't think they brew Keith's here anymore. In fact, I don't think they brew it in the province. It's all brewed in New Brunswick. But in any case, they need to preserve their brand integrity. And the integrity of the Keith's brand probably doesn't include me talking to you about anti-capitalist solutions to the post-secondary education crisis. So for clearer path, then at least they can't accuse us of breaking firework, which they probably will anyway. So among the many things that I do, I teach here at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, and I see a number of you from NASCAD here today. And I am a researcher at New York University in the Department of Art and Public Policy. But I'm also part, and I have been a part for a couple of years, of a transnational group called the EduFactory Collective. And the EduFactory Collective formed about 6 or 7 years ago between Italy and England to try and start to re-theorize and re-understand the transformations of post-secondary education around the world, specifically as they were manifesting in Europe under what was called the Bologna process, which was an effort to standardize post-secondary education across Europe as a sort of prelude to further commercializing it, And that resulted in, for instance, the imposition, or it led to the situation where tuition fees could be imposed in the UK. And what EduFactory wanted to do was to understand the way that the transformations of the university towards more higher tuition fees, towards a deeper consumer ethos, towards the imposition of student debt, towards the increasing precarity of academic workers, which means that academic workers have moved away from that sort of gold standard of tenure-track jobs where your academic freedom is guaranteed, where you have a relatively stable middle-class lifestyle, in order to support cutting-edge research. A move away from that towards increasingly part-time professors, precarious professors who can be hired and fired each year, and a sort of rolling on of the overproduction of PhDs to sort of fill the ranks of this desperate labor force who's willing to work for a pittance and willing to accept extremely precarious, extremely insecure working conditions just because they're so desperate for a job. So that now, across the United States, at least within the humanities, 70% of faculty are in this position of being precariously employed, what they call in the United States adjuncts. And at a school like NASCAD, where I teach, 70% of the education provided is provided by part-time professors. And this trend is continuing across the board. So EduFactory, the group that I'm a part of, started meeting and started pulling together post-secondary education activists from across Europe and then spreading out to North Africa, to North America, to South America, to Asia, to Australia, to try and understand this shift in the university as not just neoliberalism. Now, many of you are probably very familiar with the idea of neoliberalism. It's the reigning economic political theology that completely fuses and animates the political imagination of the ruling elites today. And it's the idea that all of society should be left open to markets, that markets are inherently the most intelligent, responsible, and efficient ways of managing human behavior. And that in order to make society more efficient in an age when we all somehow need to tighten our belts, in order to get the things that people need to people, we ought to open up every sector of the economy and every sector of social life to the idea of markets. So not only should, like Walmart, be a market, which it is, it obeys a capitalist logic, it's about making profit, winnowing down the window of waste to maximize efficiency. Not only should that be applied to the commercial sectors where we might expect it, it should also be applied to all other sectors of the economy. So it should be applied to healthcare. We should run our hospitals as if they're businesses. While they might not be oriented towards making a profit, they should be oriented towards being as efficient as possible. And we should apply that to universities. So universities, even where they're not for-profit institutions, should be transformed into institutions that maximize the efficiency, that we bring down the labor costs to an absolute minimum, that we run university courses as if they are oriented towards the profit model, and that we should begin to apply measures that we use for the market to other places in life. So we should start to measure, for instance, return on investment for education. Instead of thinking that education is a public good, that we educate the young people in our society so that they can go out and become better members of the community, we should understand university as an individualized investment that everyone makes. And therefore, students should have to measure, they should be forced to invest, they should be forced to borrow money in order to go to university, and then they should expect that the university will give them job-ready skills so that they can go out into the world and basically sell themselves as workers until they die, or until they accumulate enough money that maybe they can retire, or maybe get the few things that they want in life. So there's this massive shift under neoliberalism, not only in the way that society is structured, not only in the way that governments approach society, which is generally to cut services and cut taxes in favor of the individual consumer rather than sort of broad social goals. Neoliberalism is also a poisoned way of imagining our responsibilities towards one another. And the main point of the university, as we argue in EduFactory, is not simply to educate people or to give them skills, it's to actually teach them to be proper neoliberal subjects. Because what you get when you emerge out of university $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 in debt is a desperation to participate in a capitalist economy that actually doesn't have a use for you. In fact, you're overeducated for the vast majority of jobs that you might achieve. There aren't those rooms There aren't that sort of mass retirement that many young people have been warned about or told about, where, you know, the baby boom generations are retiring so young people can take their place. That's not happening. Increasingly, we have people with $60,000, $70,000 loans working in restaurants or coffee shops because the jobs simply don't exist. But what the university has provided, if not job-ready, market-ready skills, are workers who are desperate. Workers who know that they have to work, know that they have to accept almost any job they can get, because otherwise they won't be able to pay back their student loans. And if they can't pay back their student loans, their credit rating is going to collapse, and they're never going to be able to own a house. They're never going to be able to get a loan to buy a car, or any of the other things that they might want out of a so-called middle-class lifestyle. So the neoliberalization of education takes this form of sort of what in the 70s education theorists called the hidden curriculum. But the hidden curriculum has changed. So early education theorists started talking about the schools as a means to educate industrial workers into complicity. So what happens when you go to, let's say, an elementary school, right? You learn to obey the boss, who's the teacher. You learn to answer the bell. You learn to do your work and shut up. You learn that you have no control over the means of production, which is you have no control over what the curriculum is. You just do what you're told. And then you go home at the end of the day and you do a little homework, and then your spare time is your own. And so there's a very distinct distinction that gets made between you going to this institution and following the rules, and then you having a private life. And that small area of your private life is a sphere of consumption where you're supposed to buy things and sell things. And then the sphere of your life, which is the school, is to train you to basically become a good worker. Fine and good, that works for an industrial society, but what is the hidden curriculum of schooling in a post-industrial society, in a society where industry has been globalized, where increasingly industrial manufacturing has been moved offshore, where under the sort of neoliberal globalization agenda, where governments were forced to give up their power to regulate industry, and where industry has fled to the cheapest places in the world, where there's a race to the bottom between different industries, where countries are competing against one another to lower wages and to lower working standards in a desperate plea to get industries to come and set up shop, even if it's for only a couple of years. What's the role of education, and what's the hidden curriculum? Our argument is that the hidden curriculum is debt, that the hidden curriculum is to train people not simply to be good industrial workers who, you know, show up and then start working at the bell, stop working 8 hours later and never question authority. It's a very different sort of worker that is necessary for the capitalist economy, and that universities today are preparing. It's a highly flexibilized worker. It's a worker who is going to rely on their own skills and passions and knowledges. It's a person who's extremely self-motivated. And it's a person who is willing to sell themselves as individuals on the market. It's no longer that you just walk into a factory and hand in 8 hours a day. You're expected to provide new ideas to your boss. You're expected to go into work and for it to be your passion. You're expected to have 3 projects on the side waiting for them to come to fruition. You're expected to do unpaid internships because you just love, working for free. Because if you do that unpaid internship, maybe you can compete against 8 other people exactly like you with the same skills who might have had the privilege to do an unpaid internship. Because remember, you're not being paid, so the only people who can afford to do unpaid internships are people who come from families that can afford to let them do it. Maybe you'll be able to compete to get that one job, which probably is only a temporary contract anyway. So the new hidden curriculum of the edufactory, of the university in post-Fordist, post-industrial societies, is to train workers who are willing to basically self-exploit, who don't need to have a boss looking over their shoulder, but are so constantly consumed by worry about their debt, worry about their career chances, worry about their ability to achieve some modicum of comfort that we used to call a middle-class lifestyle. But of course the middle-class lifestyle is disappearing. Is the primary product of the university is no longer degrees, it's subjects, it's individuals, it's a comportment or a way of acting in the world. That's the basic idea of behind the Edufactory Collective. That we are now looking at the university as a place for producing subjects, and a place for producing subjects germane to a new form of capitalist exploitation, which is less interested in just enslaving our bodies in factories. 5 minutes left? Which is less interested in simply exploiting our bodies in factories, like it did in the industrial period, but is increasingly wanting us to commit our minds and indeed our souls to work in a highly precarious economy. Okay, so what I actually was going to talk about today, that's the introduction. No, is this thing that I mentioned about the struggle for the soul of education. And how I want to frame this struggle around the struggle for the soul of education is a struggle between the commons and markets. And it's notable that we're here in a market, right? But it's not a market as we're used to thinking about it. Because in fact, what we have here in the farmers' markets are commons. They're common resources. Yes, we exchange goods and services here. Yes, we pay for things. Yes, it is a market. But it's not the same as Walmart. It's not a single-minded institution finely calibrated to exploit as much of our consumer power as possible. And the fact that we go here isn't because the prices are particularly good, because they're not. It's because we're here because it's one of the few spaces of community, of common community that we have left. Now, the idea of the commons stretches back into European history. And the commons were common lands that were protected under the feudal system, so that peasants who were tied to their land, who weren't actually allowed to leave their properties, weren't allowed to leave their lands without the permission of their higher-ups, the aristocrats at the time. It was land that they could share in common, where they could graze their sheep, where they could grow subsistence crops, where they could have gatherings and festivals. Often markets would happen on commons. And what started to happen at the birth of capitalism in the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries is a process that we call enclosure, which is that the aristocracy realized they could make more money if they started to declare ownership over that land and refused to allow it to be used as a commons. And instead of allowing the peasants to use it as they saw fit and to manage it collaboratively, they would use it to graze sheep for wool, or they would use it to graze cattle for beef, or they would use it to grow monocultures of cash crops in order to be able to sell on the market. And what happened with the enclosure of the commons is a construction of a complete way of life for the European peasantry, where they were kicked off their lands, where many were forced into vagabondage, where they would wander about the countryside looking for food. At the exact same time as this was happening, European elites were using the opportunity to enclose the commons in the places that they were trying to colonize as well. So they systematically went around the world obliterating cultures where common property was the norm. So for instance, here in Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq culture was incredibly common. Most resources were held in common. Ideas of private property, especially private property around land, were extremely alien. And in order to colonize this land and open it up for European settlement, that culture needed to be destroyed. It needed to be destroyed through the imposition of religion, the imposition of European laws, direct theft of the land, the application of poisons, both intentional and unintentional, biological warfare, alcohol, and other forms of colonialism. And so what we get out of this is an idea that capitalism is not just a system where people make money because they're good entrepreneurs. It's a system based on what Karl Marx called primitive accumulation, which doesn't mean primitive in the sense that you might imagine. Thinking of that word, it means primary. It means the first stage where common property gets turned into private property. And for recent theorists who've come back to this idea of the commons and enclosure, the idea has been very useful because it's allowed us to explain this new wave of privatization that really began in the late 60s and early 70s under the title of neoliberalism, where all sorts of common resources increasingly were privatized off, both formally and informally. So healthcare systems were sold off, crown corporations were sold off, the education system was sold off piece by piece into private hands, so increasingly these things are corporatized. Increasingly, these things are offered as commodities rather than public services. And I wanted to bring this framework here in order to give us a way of thinking about our struggles in the university right now. Because of course we're struggling against neoliberalism, we're struggling against commercialization, we're struggling against the imposition of tuition fees and the further commodification of education. We're struggling against student debt and the depths that it's driving students today. We're struggling against the increasing precarity of academic labor. We're struggling against the confiscation of academic freedom on our campuses, as increasingly corporate universities don't want speech that might offend benefactors or funders or corporate partners. We're fighting against corporate partnerships on campus so that we don't have to give up the culture of research and collegiality in order to serve the interests of large biotechnology companies, large military corporations, etc. We're fighting for spaces for difference within the university, spaces for queer people to organize, spaces for anti-racist organizing, spaces for feminist organizing. All of these struggles, I think, can find common ground, if you'll excuse the pun, on this idea that the university is a commons. That there's something about the university that makes it a shared resource that we can all use, and that if we tend it together, it can thrive and can contribute to a society where we value the commons rather than valuing the idealized idea of capitalist markets. So that if we can find a way to make the university more common, if we can find ways to fight that privatization and bring our struggles together, not only can the university be a great space for us to learn, it can also be the staging ground where we can reimagine society as a whole. And the university in many ways has always been a common. There always has been a commons within it. The university has always been a place where new ideas can emerge, where difference can happen, where people can explore new ideas, and where people can explore ideas and talk about ideas outside of the imminent pressures of the market that exist in all other sectors of society. In some ways, it's a retreat, a place to retreat and to reconsider and to re-theorize and rethink and to build new forms of solidarity. But of course, on top of that University of the Commons, which exists, that we're all part of, that today we are recreating, even by just being here, by taking over a new space, by making it into a space for learning, making it into a space for building new solidarities, building new commons. We're building the University of the Commons. But even as we do that, the university is always being enclosed, right? It's always being a place where administrators, where corporate interests are constantly looking to those commons as a place to try and privatize. So for instance, it's constantly looking to those new cutting-edge ideas, those new cutting-edge ways of thinking, as means to enclose them and bring them into the fold of the university, to bring them into that realm of academic publishing, to take them out of the world of the public and just reserve them for an elite set of scholars who can understand the esoteric language. It's always looking for us for ways of thinking up new programs, new ways of responding to the world in order to offer new for-profit programs to students. It's always looking to the way that we support one another as faculty, as students, as staff, as low-level administrators. It's always looking to that as a way to reproduce the institution. Because without our cooperative common labor at the bottom, the university can't survive. So what I want to frame for you today, and we can discuss, is that these things aren't mutually exclusive. It's messy. It's a messy field that we're dealing with. Where on the one hand, we're always at work trying to restore the university to that ideal of commons, to a place where we can reimagine society, where we can commune as a verb, not as a noun, where we can do the work of commoning. At the same time, the university and institution is society's primary laboratory and capitalism's primary laboratory for figuring out new methods of enclosure. And we can't separate those out, and it becomes very, very messy. So I'm going to stop there, and then we can have a discussion, and thank you very much for listening.
Basta, yeah, basta. Oh, there will be a day when the melting pot will boil, and you only bring us closer with each war you make for oil, each union that you break, and each ballot box you stuff. Closer to the day when we cry out, enough is enough! Enough greedy politicians, enough gender role traditions, enough hierarchies, enough of living on our knees, enough gouging of the planet.